Here's a sentence that you never heard before. The 90s were weird for comics. After the crash of the speculator market, Marvel Comics were in a downward spiral, and many of their long-running characters were in a rut both creatively and in prominence. As the turn of the century encroached, Marvel would see successful indie publisher Event Comics on the rise and set their sights on their creatives. For the first time, Marvel Comics would actually outsource their characters to these new writers to revitalize characters that have fallen to the wayside. Influential books such as Ennis's Punisher, Priest's Black Panther, and Kevin Smith's Daredevil are all iconic runs in their own right, but most importantly, Inhumans by Paul Jenkins and artist Jay Lee, a critically acclaimed run that would go on to not only win awards, but also for the first time bring a group considered to be nigh irrelevant to the limelight. By 2001, the Marvel Knights imprint would go on to be widely successful, and Marvel the company would stabilize.
But Gab, get to the point. I need a character to LARP.
First off, rude. It was only, a minute? Secondly, no one at Marvel could guess what would happen next. The year was 1999. Daredevil, Man Without Fear, issue 9 would release, and while the issue itself would be important in its own right, introducing such characters as Echo and rebuilding from Kevin Smith's previous run. It would end, however, somewhat somberly as Quesada would write a note, telling readers that the acclaimed artist Arty Rosen was hospitalized due to a prolonged health condition. He was given praise for his instrumental help during Marvel's formative years and was an active collaborator with Stan Lee himself, despite never being properly credited for most of his inspirational work. Sadly, Arty Rosen would not be with us much longer, as in January of the following year, Arty Rosen would pass away from heart complications at the age of 83, given an obituary in the magazine Wizard, and at the time popular news source for collectors, comics, interviews, and cutting-edge journalism such as
Exposed, the sexy secrets from the Marvel X-Men movie set.
Or
Dangerous Curves, how Marvel's Black Widow stacks up against a new breed of bad girls.
This man lived through both world wars just to have his obituary shared column space with curved scaling. God, I am so sorry. Though Stan Lee would come out and comment on his longtime collaborator's passing. We were close, years ago, but I hadn't seen or heard from Arty in so many years. Now, while usually when someone passes, you give your condolences, set aside some time to mourn, and that would be it. But what was interesting, this wasn't the end of Arty's story. In fact, his death was merely the start of the next chapter, and something shocking would unfold. A month later, Wizard Comics would run a story that brought a rumor front and center. That rumor being Marvel stumbled across old sketches and story information from a never-before-seen hero curated by Stan Lee himself, which would be nothing new. But what would be, though hard to make out, it seemed whoever this hero was curated before the Fantastic Four. This was earth-shattering news. While it's true that Stan Lee did work with Marvel before the Fantastic Four, all of that work was not Cape Comics. They were more in line with the popular at the time genres such as war stories and monster comics. But when the Fantastic Four were introduced, that changed the superhero genre forever. So to imply that Stan Lee, the face of not only superheroes, but comics as a whole, potentially had concepts that predated the birth of the Silver Age would be the holy grail of comics. I'd be more than happy to look at the sketches to try and help Marvel out in any way I could. Like I said, I'm not sure what it is they found, but if it really is something I created way back when, I'd at least like to take a look at it. Now, these are just rumors, but these claims were about to get a lot more validity as Arty Rosen's widow would come down to Marvel headquarters and drop off a box, and what inside would change everything. Never before seen sketches, stories left on Quesada's desk, and with a stroke of luck, writer Paul Jenkins, coming fresh off his Inhumans run, took the folder by mistake on his way out. And when Jenkins got home and looked through the folder, he was in for a surprise. A single issue, Startling Stories #1, featured the origins of a character simply called the Sentry. This was the character those rumors were murmuring about, the true catalyst for what would become the comic juggernaut known as Marvel. Somehow stumbled on a poor writer's coffee table, Jenkins was absolutely enamored by the character and immediately reached out to his collaborator, Jay Lee, and was getting ready to work on their Namor run together, flat out told him to put whatever they were going to do on hold indefinitely, as Jenkins found his sights on something truly magnificent, the Sentry. Paul Jenkins pushed forward and pitched a new book to Marvel Comics. For the first time in history, the hero, the Sentry, would finally, after 4 decades, see the light of day in a 5-issue story under the Marvel Knights imprint. Coinciding with the approval of the Sentry book, Wizard Magazine would tell all about the story in that month's issue. The very existence of the Sentry runs contrary to everything we know about the origins of what is now the Marvel Universe. Bob Harris, editor-in-chief, would explain, when the news broke of such a revelation, the forums absolutely exploded. People were not only shocked at the omission by Marvel themselves, but they're finally going to have his story told by a high-profile author. The thing was, though, some posters were seemingly skeptical as some of these details didn't add up. Who was exactly this Rosen character? There were never any works published under the name Arty Rosen, no interviews with the guy, or even a single mention of the guy. It seems as if this Arty Rosen character didn't exist before 2000, and that's because he didn't. Everything I just told you was a lie, sold to you by Marvel Comics. This was a collective effort to gaslight an entire community. The art, notes, and interviews all really did happen, but it wasn't some unearthing of lost history, but rather a marketing stunt to promote Jenkins and Lee's latest book. The Sentry wasn't some long-lost hero from the 60s, but rather the 90s, as Paul Jenkins had the idea for the character during his time writing at DC's Vertigo line, who came across the classic Golden Age hero, Hourman. Rex Tyler was a brilliant chemist who created the superpower drug called Miracolo, and when consumed for a 60-minute period would gain super strength, durability, and speed, hence the name Hourman. But it came with a catch. After that hour-long window was closed, Rex Tyler would have to wait 24 hours for the pill to completely leave his system before ingesting again. Now, Jenkins was never a massive fan of the superhero genre. His words, not mine. He was more familiar with the likes of fantasy and horror. Not that he hated them like a Garth Ennis, he simply favored the independent circles like Tundra and Mirage Comics, where he worked at both as an editor. What he did have disdain for were the ridiculous trends of the 90s, where comics were seen as a foil-covered investment and a lackluster story to hold up said value. As the independent boom of the 80s would die out in favor of the gaudy Cape Comics of the 90s, his relationship with them was, well, let's just say it wasn't getting any better. But Hourman intrigued him. The idea of a pill that could give anyone who ingested it the pinnacle of human strength sounded like the most addictive substance a person can take. He wanted to write a Vertigo book where it followed Hourman outside of that 60-minute window, seeing him come down from such a tremendous high and quite literally get addicted to the idea of heroism. He would take that idea to editor Karen Berger and pitch his brilliant idea to shake up a long-forgotten golden "we don't make hero books." What? Vertigo isn't a line for superheroes. So, Paul Jenkins would go back to the drawing board and draft up his own character. No longer Hourman, his name would now be Robert Reynolds, the Sentry, still carrying those same themes of mental illness and addiction, but with a fresh coat of paint. He would take his retooled pitch and return to Karen Berger's office. He was immediately rejected. Again, they really don't make superhero books. So, Paul Jenkins would continue on writing his Hellblazer run, putting the idea of the Sentry on the back burner for the time being, until he was approached by Marvel Comics and wanted him to write under their upcoming Marvel Knights banner. Artist Jay Lee actually suggested the idea of wanting to collaborate with Jenkins, being a massive fan of his Vertigo run. Marvel expected him to pitch them a book, so with the help of comic legend Rick Veitch providing new concept art of the Sentry and actively helped to flesh out the ideas Jenkins had, he would go on to call Marvel headquarters, eager to give them his magnum opus. Oh, we want you to do the right Inhumans. Yeah, you know, the Inhumans. We'd think you'd be great at it. And great he did, because him and Jay Lee would go on to win a fucking Eisner Award and garner many more awards, but that Eisner Award was now his golden ticket to his Golden Guardian of Good, because afterwards, he would go to Marvel and finally, after almost a decade of being rejected, would get the Sentry run off the ground. Joe Quesada, after hearing this pitch, would actually go ahead of Jenkins and actually start his Arty Rosen rumor in his Daredevil book. Paul was a little apprehensive of the idea of a hoax. He was already stressed enough coming off his run on the Inhumans and feeling even more pressure from his readership. A hoax would only garner more eyes on him and Lee's work. But as Quesada was able to rope in everyone else, Jenkins was far more accepting and then leaned into the rumors, giving us the book I finally get to talk about now. Now, I want to get this out of the way as quickly as possible. I'm not going to just summarize the book to you. Look, there's multiple other videos out there that will go over every nook and cranny of the Sentry's history, and it's just not something I'm interested in. Now, if you haven't read the Sentry before, I will go over just enough so you can still enjoy the video. As always, I think you'll enjoy the video much more if you're at least somewhat read on Bob Reynolds. So if I don't close every plot thread neatly or leave stories unresolved, then that'll be that. Plus, between you and me, I think Paul Jenkins is 100 times the writer I am, and if I simply summarize his work, it would be essentially eating a regurgitation of a 5-star meal, and I don't think you deserve that. But with that, finally, and I mean for real this time, I will actually talk about the book itself. The Sentry follows a mild-mannered man, a diagnosed schizophrenic with agoraphobia. He hates heights just as much as he hates crowds, but despite his demons, he has a tender heart, preferring cartoons over CNN and his favorite food being cereal. The only superfan he has is his wife, Lindy, who helps Bob manage his agoraphobia and is always there for him alongside their pet dog, Normie. They would live seemingly mundane lives far removed from the marvelous world of heroics, though that's only how it seems on the surface. As Robert is awoken in the middle of the night, something common for the timid man, but something's different about this time. He was awoken not by thunder, was rather an ominous foe nobody, especially Bob, could ever forget. It was the void. He had returned, and as Bob wanders through his home, he feels as if his memories aren't his own as he grabs a cookbook by chance. No, destiny. He opens it up, and despite the hazy memories, this isn't something he could forget. How could he? Staring right back at him was the serum that made him the Sentry, and he would become him once more, knowing now more than ever he had a purpose. His purpose is to fight his arch nemesis, the Void. His resolve will only grow stronger as he consumes the elixir. He turns to his best friend Normie, contorting, and what appears before him is his greatest fear. He taunts him, promising him he will return, and when he does, his world will be torn asunder. So the Sentry sets off and visits iconic Marvel characters, trying desperately to get them to remember, but no matter how hard he tries, they can only draw a blank, only able to leave vague hints to his past. The Marvel heroes can only pick up the puzzle pieces as the mystery unfolds, each discovering they've all had a personal history with the Sentry, Mr. Fantastic being the best man at Robert's wedding and Peter earning a Pulitzer Prize because of him. The story would take a dramatic turn when Bob finds Tony Stark at a mixer where he confronts him. Out of all the heroes he had encountered so far, Tony has vague memories of who the Sentry is, but all of it feels so wrong, as if he wasn't supposed to remember any of it. But what he can vividly recall, after something horrible happened, the Sentry was surrounded and held at an intervention. He needed to be held responsible for something that he couldn't put his finger on. The only person who stood up for him, however, was of course Iron Man, while everyone else, including his best friend, Reed Richards, declared that the Sentry must die. What I truly love about this book is the sense of magnificence. The man who was constantly referred to as the best of us by Marvel's most notable heroes, that he is truly gone, like a gaping hole that was there for years, only now being felt for the first time with the return of the Sentry. Despite all of his grand adventures of heroism, his presence is only known in the background of all of these heroes' lives, an idol for idols, completely gone, with no trace, nothing to be remembered by, kinda like an Ozymandias figure, someone so mighty, a golden god, now reduced to an overweight drunk, essentially ruins with nothing to show for. But ironically, this is the greatest sacrifice Rob has made, to give up not just his powers, but every memory of it, to be completely forgotten by history. To save the world, he was always there for one last time. Even in his final moments, he is simply a humble man, apologizing to his best man for returning and having them deal with his burdens, because he couldn't do it alone. You can absolutely feel the compassion that Jenkins has for the Sentry, the way he talks about him both inside the book and outside within interviews. He masterfully juggles between these two tones of somber, but yet surprisingly hopeful when it comes to the Sentry. Despite having to be literally ripped away from the history books, hidden from everyone's mind, what you can't remove is that influence. Even if you don't know where it comes from, no matter how hard you think, years removed, you can still feel the Sentry's legacy. Even in the darkest of moments, there's at least a glimmer of light to guide you. I think a lot of this sense of grandeur comes from the fact that Paul Jenkins was unfamiliar with the superhero genre, as mentioned earlier. He's able to write from the perspective of someone far removed from all the heroics that is Marvel Comics with Bob, and how they're slowly being emerged panel by panel. But despite that fact, he's able to give a really great homage to different eras of Cape Comics, emulating their styles for brief moments. My favorite instance of this is at the start, where it follows the twilight years of the Sentry, and it's an obvious homage to The Dark Knight Returns, where the Sentry is a lot more bulky, similar to Miller's Batman, rather than the toned physique we see him typically as. The book itself feels more so a conspiracy thriller rather than a big superhero bash. For someone as strong as the Sentry, there's no real big bad to fight outside of the final issue. Even then, it's mostly off-screen and only described to us, but I think it does a really great job to show the readers how far removed we are from this era of the Silver Age, that this isn't some great big evil to beat down in a massive crossover. This is far more personal than that. This is a completely mental battle that the Sentry has been fighting for years alone. This is a man that needs help. The reference to bygone comic eras is a part of the core themes that the Sentry exemplifies, and that it's a postmodern superhero story. First and foremost, The Sentry is a postmodern story about superheroes than just a standard tale of heroics. Jesus, aren't I pretentious, dude, asshole? You might ask, what is postmodernism? It's probably one of those words you hear by video essayists like me who have no clue what they're talking about and inject buzzwords that sound smart to meet word counts. But postmodernism, to put it simply, is a rejection of absolute truths and champions subjective reality shaped by cultural context and the individual than a grand overarching narrative. Typically in comics, it breaks down traditional storytelling through metafiction and is aware of outside mediums. Think of something like Doom Patrol by Grant Morrison or a Watchmen by Alan Moore, which are constantly picking apart the medium and use their respective narratives to explore those themes. Now, when it's explained like that, you can see what I mean, hopefully. The Sentry is all about unreliable narrators who barely know anything, or at best, know only half-truths. Even our main character, Robert Reynolds, can hardly be trusted due to his mental health problems and the fact that he's under the belief that the Void is his arch enemy and not himself. When you can't even trust the smartest man in the universe, Reed Richards, to have the answers, then who can you really trust? But as well, the entire idea of him having the ability to warp reality around him and using that power to quite literally write himself out of the fabric of the Marvel Universe, essentially the idea of a retcon, because reality itself is malleable. It's not set in stone. It's manipulated, which I know it's easy to say. It's common for Marvel to retcon their stories, but really, for better or for worse, Marvel really hasn't done a sweeping change in their continuity in a way like DC has, so the Sentry manipulating himself out of the narrative does have this level of gravitas to it. I think the hoax itself helped elevate this message because it makes complete sense that in the 60s, Marvel would try to make their own Superman pastiche. I mean, for a time, the most popular hero was exactly that with Captain Marvel. Then in interviews, Stan Lee would try to give an explanation why they didn't go through creating him. It may have been for the good of us all. I seem to recall that he was too big. He was so powerful, he could very well have destroyed the entire Marvel universe and everything we were planning. I wish I could remember, but I really can't specifically recall why I didn't continue on with the Sentry. It's a completely believable scenario, and that perfectly plays into the overall meta narrative of the Sentry. I think what amplifies this the most is Jay Lee's cover to issue 5 of the Sentry, placing the Sentry not front and center, placing him in the back of the lineup. While he was standing shoulder to shoulder with Marvel's greatest heroes, he was hidden in plain sight, and we simply overlooked him. His influence is still there, even if we can't put it into words. A Superman pastiche or a knockoff is a dime a dozen trope you see in every corner of the superhero genre. You got your Omni-Mans, your Homelanders. Hell, even Marvel would do that a year prior with their Hyperion Max series by JMS, but what makes the Sentry so interesting is that it would be so easy to make the Sentry a two-dimensional super good guy with an evil side, but how Paul Jenkins frames him is really interesting. A staple in Superman stories is the idea of the secret identity and the double life that Clark and Kal-El lead. While everyone sees Superman as his inspirational figure, the best a man can be, a guardian in the sky who will watch over us, they kind of glance over the mild reporter Clark Kent as some nobody. The in-universe mistake someone would make is that these are two separate people because their personalities are worlds apart. But with Robert Reynolds, the Sentry is merely an extension of himself. Without him, there is no Golden Guardian of Good, because the Sentry is all the best parts of Reynolds condensed into one being. The quiet, patient, compassionate demeanor where he can extend his hand out to anyone in need. It doesn't matter to him. It's all Robert, but without the baggage. The tragedy in this is that the Sentry becomes an ideal version of the man. Bob can never achieve these same heights as the Sentry because his demons hold him back. But he didn't get rid of those demons. Just like how he compartmentalized his best values, he did the same to his worst, his greatest foe, the Void. Again, it would be so simple to make him this evil mustache twirling bastard, but the Void is more than that. Just like how the Sentry is Bob, his self-destructive tendencies are taken to a next level, personified to constantly undercut every achievement Bob has made, an equivalent exchange, if you will. For every life saved, one has to die. But that makes the Void so interesting. He isn't exactly evil, he is simply Bob at his lowest. Okay, I know technically the Sentry isn't exactly a Superman knockoff. He's more closer to the likes of Captain Marvel, and you can see that even in the first few pages where lightning cracks the sky, an allusion to Billy Batson, where he says his iconic line, Shazam, and he transforms. But look, like I said, Captain Marvel in and of himself is a Superman pastiche, so there's still DNA in him. But with that being said, what I do want to talk about when it comes to Captain Marvel likes is the most famous one being Miracle Man by Alan Moore, where I feel like the ending to the original 2000 Sentry run is like a direct response to a particular scene from Alan Moore's classic. In Miracle Man, a lot of the drama comes from the fact that the hero himself is this godlike being and has this disconnect from Michael Moran, his civilian counterpart, and his wife. After being constantly roped in the insanity that is Miracle Man, she breaks down and leaves. Then shortly after, their daughter gains powers just like Miracle Man and an intelligence rivaling his own, saying that she's already learned everything she could from Miracle Man and then would soon venture off into space, leaving Michael Moran all alone because he became Miracle Man. The issue concludes with him writing a final note and surrendering himself completely to the Miracle Man to reshape the world into a utopia soon after. I say that the Sentry is a response to this moment because in the book's final pages, we see Robert Reynolds completely discarding his history as the Sentry and deciding to live his mundane life with his wife, Lindy. The book closes on him struggling to muster up the courage to order a simple burger, but as he stares off at the cashier, he has a vision of his former alter ego, the Sentry, telling him to order a chili dog. This here is such a powerful moment because he's using his alter ego to overcome the challenges in his life, to understand and make sense of a world that before didn't make any sense to Robert. But the important part is that he's still Robert, not surrendering himself to the Sentry. The reason why these heroes are so great is not because of their immeasurable strength, but instead the heart that they carry, something Miracle Man completely forgot, and Bob, despite all his flaws, carries a heavy heart on his sleeve at every moment. That's not something a serum gave him. No, that's something he always had. Ultimately, the story of the Sentry is an optimistic one rather than a somber one. To kill your inner self like Michael Moran did, you can never truly heal. Despite how hard it may be, Robert still has a chance to grow, which I think is the most fascinating part of his character. Now, I've already gone ad nauseum about Bob's mental health, so I'll put that on ice and come back to it in a second, but I do want to focus on Bob's addictive personality. While Bob is an alcoholic, his biggest addiction is being a superhero. It goes back to the idea that Jenkins had with Hourman, the concept of being able to take a pill, or in Bob's case a serum, to feel the rush of being the pinnacle of humanity and thus becoming reliant on it, as we see at the start of the book, with the Dark Knight Returns illusion. But it goes deeper than that. The reason Bob was so addicted to the serum was because of the validation it brought to him. Imagine this, a single drop turned Bob from a nobody with a plethora of mental issues into an idolized deity that even other heroes fawned over. Bob, for the first time, felt that he was wanted and that he wasn't a burden to everyone around him. So of course, he built a dependency on the serum. To save the world becomes a compulsion that continually threatens to consume him. This dependency compounded and made both extreme ends of his spectrum stronger and stronger, all personified into one being known as the Void. In a way, his self-destructive nature became his greatest arch nemesis that Bob continues to enable by taking the serum. Jenkins actually went out of his way to establish Bob's mental health, a paranoid schizophrenic with agoraphobia with a slight general anxiety disorder, and tried writing solely within that diagnosis as much as possible. Paul Jenkins said that he hates writing villains who are evil for the sake of being evil. People have to adhere to something. The reason people are crazy to us because they adhere to a logic that doesn't make sense to you or I. I think that's why the Sentry works so well, because his mental illness doesn't necessarily take away from Bob's agency. He's the one in control doing all of this. I think a moment that perfectly gives insight into this is during the Skrull invasion. The Sentry is manipulated to leave Earth. While this is happening, Bob's wife, Lindy, is under attack, and if nobody intervenes, will soon perish. But then comes in the Void, and instead of letting it happen, he rushes to her aid, saying, "I'm going to do what Bob never could, and protect you." Ripping through the alien, this entity of pure darkness tries confronting her as she weeps. I find it so fascinating because it shows that even our deepest, most repressed parts of us are exactly that, us. Jenkins made it a deliberate effort to make the Void not crazy for the sake of being crazy. It's still him, and Bob, for all his faults, would never lay a hand on Lindy. So of course, the Void would love her just as much. And again, plays off into the idea of equivalent exchange. The Sentry leaving Earth, so therefore the opposite reaction would be the Void coming back to fight the Skrull army. And I think Jenkins himself would put it best. The story of the Sentry isn't just about the Sentry and the Void. It's about the man Bob Reynolds caught between both its extremes. But Bob isn't the only person caught between these two versions of himself, but also the people around him, The people they choose to surround themselves with says a lot about them as a person. One that might come to the mind, the Hulk. In a lot of ways, they're alike. They both suffer from immense trauma and mental illness that have manifested in their own persona and are turned away by their support groups. But that's what draws Bob towards the Hulk. The Sentry sees his own reflection in Banner and wants to offer the same support that he wished he could have received, offering him shelter, even having an aura stated to soothe the Green Giant. The Hulk is one of the few people that truly understand the Sentry because they know what it's like to be rejected, though the the Hulk isn't the only one who looks towards the Sentry for guidance. He's a guiding light to many new faces, such as Spider-Man and the X-Men. What I find interesting is that the member of the original 5 X-Men that the Sentry gravitates towards the most is Angel. Now, this is way before his tumultuous time as a Horseman of Apocalypse, and even Bob himself was surprised to see Warren's transformation. But what I always like to imagine, because it's the Sentry, he can kind of just do whatever, is that maybe subconsciously he knew something would happen to Warren in the future after his disappearance, and knowing what it's like to balance between two radically different personalities, constantly at odds with one another, wanted to offer some form of guidance to Warren. But his closest ally? Reed Richards, I think, speaks the most about Bob as a character. You see, Reed Richards is the closest thing the Sentry has to a true equal. What he lacks in strength, Reed makes up in intelligence, emotional intelligence. Him being a super genius allows him to pick up on the subtle details. He's the first out of everyone to notice something isn't exactly right with the Sentry and genuinely extends a hand towards him. In turn, Reed is one of the few people the Sentry can truly open up to and gives Reed power over him, giving him administrator access to Clock, and even gives him the authority to destroy the Sentry and bury his name under a pile of lies. His relationship with Reed is a symptom of a larger problem that Robert has, and it's his need to appeal to authority. You have to imagine it from Sentry's perspective. When you're constantly viewed as the best of everyone, literally compared to Christ himself, and you encounter a problem so heavy that you can't solve it alone, then who can? Bob lives in a cognitive dissonance where he should be able to overcome anything. Everyone expects him to because he's the Sentry, but he can't. Even worse, who's realistically going to stop you? Spider-Man isn't going to web you up. You control the molecular structure of everything. You can literally pop Pete from existence. So that's why when there's someone who tells him that they can save him, Bob submits to these authority figures without any question. He sees people like Norman and Tony as trustworthy because after so long of having to carry the burden of not just a million exploding suns, but everyone else, he wants someone to step up, take after him, and lead the charge while telling Bob that everything will be okay. He so desperately wants to find peace, but these people are only there to manipulate him, using the Sentry for their own means. This is because by constantly undercutting his own authority, he can't truly heal. He is forced to recognize that only Bob can find balance between the Sentry and the Void. He needs to find his own agency to take control of his own problems. Bob, throughout his entire history as a character, has been running away from who he truly is, either by living as a mundane man, hiding away from the rest of civilization, taking orders from powerful men in hopes they can help him, or living in a false reality. None of these will ever work because it neglects the one simple fact. The Sentry, the Void, and Bob are all one and the same, and that's why to truly heal, to truly be whole, Bob has to adhere to his own rules, not someone else's. After 15 years, Paul Jenkins would finally return to the character and bring him back to the mainline continuity after being snapped like a twig by Cates. But the main focus of the book is Reynolds coming to terms with the fact that their beloved dog, Normie, is dying. Lindy begs Bob to do something. Even for a couple weeks, there has to be something he can do. But Bob relents. He comforts his wife and tells Lindy that no, there really isn't anything he can do. Intercut are flashbacks of a young Robert where he clutches a history book as he learns of the dog Laika, whose entire life was of torment, being a stray that had to endure countless cold nights, and her price for surviving, a one-way ticket to space where she would die alone, terrified as her shuttle buckled and shook. A young Bob would be heartbroken that he couldn't do anything to save her. This would be the first time the Void engulfed him, just like poor Laika. While this is happening, Wilson Fisk is dying, and his crime empire is on the verge of collapsing. The Void cornered Kingpin in an alleyway, promising him that he's going to suffer slowly and painfully, but don't worry, he's going to keep him alive. During the entire book, I was anticipating for the Sentry to collide with the Void to see what happens to Kingpin. How is Bob going to mess all of this up? But then nothing happened. The Kingpin, after near death, his cells literally deteriorating, he just comes back, and the Void simply tells him he'll see him again real soon. I thought having Normie die would have the Void break out and cause mayhem, but nope. Bob goes on to save the day like nothing happened. But then he tells Reed something that recontextualizes everything. People just think I'm crazy. That's all they see, but they never see that I'm trying to heal. It goes back to what Jenkins said about how people are trying to adhere to their own rules. For the first time, the Void and the Sentry have made peace. The Sentry has finally realized he can't run away from the Void. It's always going to be a part of him, so he tries to exist with it. By recognizing his own agency, he's able to finally find a healthy outlet with the Void. By healthy outlets, I mean destroying billionaire-infested islands or draining Wilson Fisk as a battery, overdrafting his Void side so he can act as a Sentry with peace in mind. Bob is following his own rules set by him, not what people think is right for him. The perfect encapsulation of this rule is him refusing to heal Normie. While Normie's passing was a tragedy, no doubt, Normie had a long, fulfilled life with a warm home and a loving family to come home to every night. By letting go of Normie, he's able to give that same love to someone who was never afforded that opportunity. Reynolds flies out into space. He is able to fulfill a promise he made to someone so long ago as he comes home holding an old friend, Laika. Finally, after tragedy, is able to find peace, just like for the first time, our hero has found peace within himself.